Okay, welcome to ACT video 302. This is the second of two reading videos. If you haven't watched ACT reading video 301, I would encourage you to do that first. Video 301 is a how-to, so how to go about doing the reading passage. This video, ACT reading video 302, is not a how-to. This is where we actually apply our skills to a specific passage, and I picked a double passage for us today. By the way, this passage is from ACT April 2014. This is the first test under your course materials. So if you want to pause the video now, try this double passage on your own, and then compare your notes with mine and how you do with this video, by all means do that. Otherwise, we're just going to dig right into it. And as you remember from the reading video 301, we're going to spend, it's not going to break down this way when we actually do this video, but what you'd want to spend is about, out of 8 minutes, 45 seconds, you want to spend about 4.5 minutes reading and about 4.5 minutes answering questions, roughly. Obviously, we'll go way over on this video, but that's just a good model to keep track of. And as we're reading, we're paying close attention to, one, what is the author is trying to communicate to us in each paragraph, and two, the structure. So what's kind of happening where? Are we trying to analyze things at a higher level? No, because most of the questions we get are going to be very specific questions where we just need to know where to look. And the ones where we do need to analyze, some are big picture, and hopefully we can get those ones, but a lot will tell us exactly where we need to look if we have to look back. So anyway, let's get to it. We'll read passage A first, answer passage A questions, passage B second, answer passage B questions, and the ones that pertain to both. Okay, so let's do it. So passage A is adapted from the article Ginkgo, the Story of the Oldest Tree on Earth by Roger Cohn, and that's from 2013. Passage B is adapted from the book Ginkgo, the Tree That Time Forgot by Peter Crane. In the interview featured in passage A, Crane refers to his 2013 book Ginkgo, the Tree That Time Forgot, a selection from which is presented as passage B. The fossils referred to in the 6th paragraph of passage A and in the 1st paragraph of passage B are the same. Okay, so these are all just important to be aware of. And this is going to be the interview. Okay. Roger Cohn is the interviewer. Roger Cohn. You've been studying ginkgo trees for a long time. How did you come to develop an interest in them? Peter Crane. I think that anyone who is seriously interested in plants inevitably comes across ginkgo pretty early in their training, because there are only 5 living groups of seed plants, and ginkgo is one of them. So ginkgo is kind of part of this rare remaining category of seed plants. And ginkgo is the only one of the seed plants that consists of just one species. So it's an important plant in any botanist's view of the world. You inevitably run across it early in your training. So what's the point of this paragraph? It's that ginkgo is rare, okay? You come across it early in your training because it's just very unique. You've mentioned that ginkgo is something of a biological oddity, in that it's a single species with no living relatives. That's somewhat unusual in the plant and animal world, isn't it? Yes, Peter Crane says. When we think about flowering plants, there are about 350,000 living species, and they're all more closely related to each other than they are to anything else. But the ginkgo is solitary and unique. By the way, I tend to circle numbers and proper nouns just so I can locate them easily. Not very obviously related to any living plant. One of the points I wanted to draw out in this book, he's referring to his 2013 book, which is passage B, we have an excerpt from, is that in the past, there were a variety of ginkgo-like plants, but this is the only one surviving. So the key thing we get from this is that the ginkgo is not only unique from the previous paragraph, but it's also the only one of its kind. So whereas a lot of other seed plant species are related to one another, or flowering plants, ginkgo doesn't really have any living relations. You described the ginkgo as a living fossil in the sense that in many ways it's unchanged in more than 20 million years. How do we know that? Peter Crane. If you look at fossils from more than 200 million years ago, you can see leaves that are very, very similar to the modern ginkgo leaves. But you have to look more closely to really assess whether those leaves were produced by plants that are identical to the modern ginkgo. And that work has been done now by my colleague, this guy, who has worked on younger fossil material from China. And what he's noticed is that there are some differences in the ways that the seeds are attached in these fossil plants. But in the grand scheme of things, they're not very different. So essentially, this guy has analyzed ginkgos from a long time ago, and he's realized that overall they're pretty similar. The only minor difference to today's ginkgos, the only minor difference is in the way seeds are attached. With the fossils that I've worked on myself from about 65 million years ago, so not as long ago, we were able to determine exactly how the seeds were attached to the plant, and they were attached in an identical way to the modern ginkgo. If we could go back in a time machine, maybe we would find some differences, but I suspect not. So the key takeaway on these two paragraphs is that this guy goes back further in the past with his fossils than Peter Crane. And what Zhao Zhan finds, if I said that name wrong, I apologize, but what he finds is that essentially the ginkgo plant is the ancient one is very similar to the one of today, except for the way the seeds are attached. Okay. So let's hit the questions. And again, when you're reading, maybe you pick up that much. You want to try to pick up those things, but don't get bogged down on time. Just make sure you understand the main idea and where things are happening. Okay. So passage A can best be described as a portion of an interview in which the interviewer uses prior knowledge of the interviewee's expertise relating to the study of ginkgo to help guide his question. So this is the right answer, and you know it right from the jump. So the first thing the interviewer says is, you've been studying ginkgo trees for a long time. So how did you develop an interest? The second thing he says is, you've mentioned that the ginkgo is something of a biological oddity. And then he says, you describe a ginkgo as a living fossil. So clearly the interviewer has done his research, and he knows that the person he's interviewing, he has prior knowledge on that person and what he's written about ginkgos. But let's look at B. Discovers the fact that the interviewee has a background. No, he already knows that the guy studies ginkgos. Mentions the findings of other ginkgo experts. He never mentions the finding of other ginkgo experts. You have to be really careful here. It's asking, this is rule number 3, read the question carefully. The interviewer doesn't bring up other researchers. Peter Crane, the interviewee, brings up Zhao Zhan. Hints at his own findings. Okay, so the interviewer doesn't have any of his own findings. Never mentions that. Okay, 32. What reason does Crane provide in passage A for botanists coming across the ginkgo early in training? So this is really a word search question. It's so specific. It's what reason is Crane giving that we come across ginkgos early, botanists come across ginkgos early in training? So we just have to kind of remember the paragraph where that's talked about. And it's in this first paragraph from Peter Crane. He says, I think anyone who is seriously interested in plants inevitably comes across the ginkgo tree pretty early in training. And then he says why. He says the reason why is there are only 5 living groups of seed plants. Ginkgo is one of them. And the ginkgo is the only one that consists of just one species. So it's among the 5 groups of seed plants and consists of just one species. Ginkgo is one of 5 living groups of seed plants, and ginkgo makes up only one group that consists of one species alone. Okay, so it's no higher level thinking, just making sure word for word that's what's supported by the passage. But let's just look at F. Ginkgo is the only species to be one of the 5 living groups of seed plants, and also to be included in a second, nothing about a second group. That's where that turns sour. I always look to cross off the minute. It can't be partially right, the answer. All of it has to be right. So the minute one part is incorrect, it's all incorrect. Okay, ginkgo is more common and easier to locate. Now, he doesn't say he doesn't talk about it being more common or easier to locate. Ginkgo is one of the 5 species that together form the living group of seed plants that has the fewest members. Again, there's just nothing in the passage that says anything about this. All of this is quite confusing, but if you just literally locate exactly where it is, then you have your answer. No higher level thinking. Okay, 33. In context of passage A, Crane mentions the evolutionary relationship among the approximately 350,000 species of flowering plants, primarily two. So let's see where he mentions it, and then we'll know exactly why he mentioned it. So he says, yes, when we think about flowering plants, there are about 350,000 living species, and they're all more closely related to each other than they are to anything else. But the ginkgo is solitary and unique, not very obviously related to any living plant. So he's showing how solitary and unique the ginkgo is. There are hundreds of thousands of species, and they're all closely related in some way or another, but the ginkgo is not. So he's setting up a contrast between the ginkgo and other species. Make clear the focus of his book. No, he's not relating this back to his book. So that's an assumption. Share an intriguing scientific fact. He's not just sharing a fact for the sake of sharing it. He's trying to illustrate his specific knowledge of how unique the ginkgo is. Discredit one of Kahn's beliefs. The interviewer doesn't have any beliefs that we know of. Okay. The main purpose of the last paragraph of passage A is for Crane 2. So the last paragraph, Crane says, with the fossils that I've worked on myself from about 65 million years ago, we were able to determine exactly how the seeds were attached to the plant. They were attached in an identical way to the modern ginkgo. If we go back in a time machine, maybe we would find some differences, but I suspect not. So essentially, the function of the last paragraph is for Crane to make the point that the modern ginkgo isn't really any different than its ancestor dating back 65 million years, or is not that different as far as he's aware. To share a key step in how he and others were able to reach a conclusion about ginkgo evolution, maybe. Relate his disappointment, no disappointment. And no time machine. G's actually kind of funny if you read it. Argue that his own findings about ginkgo are inferior. No, he's not comparing himself. If you ever see a comparison, always kind of tap on it to see if it actually stands up, if there actually was a comparison being made. I find usually comparisons aren't made, but they give it often as an answer choice, even when the passages don't have them. Okay, describe how the seeds are attached in modern ginkgo. A lot of people go for J on this one, and it's wrong. He never tells you how the seeds are attached, right? If you really press on that and look at this last paragraph, Peter Crane is not telling you how the seeds are attached. He says they were able to determine how they were attached, but he doesn't actually tell you how they're attached. His point in this last paragraph is he says, hey, we're able to figure out that ginkgos remain relatively unchanged going back 65 million years, and that the seeds have attached in an identical way going back that far. So he's sharing a key step in how he and others were able to reach a conclusion about ginkgo evolution. He and the we that he talks about, so I've and we, were able to reach a key conclusion that ginkgos haven't changed that much over 65 million years by analyzing the seeds. Okay. Anyway, let's go to passage B. So now we read this, and this will set us up for the rest of the questions. Let me move my head out of the way. And we remember this is an excerpt from Peter Crane's book. Okay. It is surprising, given the widespread occurrence of ginkgo-like plants through the Jurassic and Cretaceous, that few fossils relevant to ginkgo's life story are found in the Yixian Formation, a geological formation in northeast China known for its remarkable fossil deposit. However, in 2003, the same guy that Peter Crane referenced in the sixth paragraph of the previous passage, and his colleague described the unequivocal ginkgo fossils of early Cretaceous age, and that dated from 120 million to 125 million years ago. From these beds for the first time, these new ginkgo fossils help fill the gap between the truly ancient ginkgos and the essentially modern ones. So the key of this paragraph is that this group of researchers have found ginkgos that fill the gap between the modern ginkgo and the ancient ones that go back further. And we remember from the previous passage that the modern ginkgo is 65 million years to present. Okay, anyway. Fossil collecting at this mountain in the Yixian Formation turned up about a dozen indisputable ginkgo leaves, along with 7 seed-bearing structures that seem to have been preserved at slightly different stages of maturity. The leaves are unusually small compared with the leaves of modern ginkgo. None of them are much more than about an inch long, and they are deeply divided. The seed-bearing structures are also small, and in all cases, they were more or less unbranched. At their tips, they bore up to about 3 to 6 tiny seeds. Among the specimens were a few seed stalks with immature seeds still attached, but there were also some with a large seed attached and large scars from which others had been shed. Zhao Zhen and Xiaolin Zhang named the leaves and associated seed-bearing structures ginkgopods. Okay, so a lot going on in this paragraph, but we don't want to get bogged down in the detail. Essentially, they have a pretty nice array of ginkgo's plants from 120 to 125 million years ago in different fossils in different stages of their life cycle. And some contain seeds, others don't have seeds, and they contain seeds of different sizes. The importance of ginkgo apodus, so this intermediate ginkgo, is that it fits nicely in the age gap between ginkgo geminis at about 170 million years ago. So that's the one that goes the furthest back, and fossils that are essentially the same as modern ginkgo, about 65 million years ago. So it bridges a gap in the ginkgo's evolution. It is also conveniently intermediate in structure. Ginkgo geminis has a seed-bearing stalk that divided into 3 or 4 branches, each bearing a single seed at its tip. However, in ginkgo apodus, the branches of the seed stalk are almost non-existent, and the seeds are attached closer together at its tip. Okay, so the ancient one essentially has multiple branches, and with the seeds, and then this one pretty much just has one branch with seeds. Okay, this is much more like modern ginkgo. So modern ginkgo doesn't have multiple branches, although in the living species, there are normally just 2 seeds on each seed-bearing structure rather than 3 to 6. Zhao Zhen concluded that the pervasive trend in the evolution of ginkgo, at least in the seed-bearing structures, has been one of reduction from about 6 seeds on separate stalks in the ancient one to about 2 seeds on an unbranched seed stalk in the living plant. Okay, so that's what we got. Is that essentially over time, the key takeaway from this paragraph is over time between the ancient ginkgo and the modern one, we just have less branches and less seeds. I know, fascinating stuff, right? Okay, let's do the questions. The main point of the last paragraph is that it is noteworthy that the seeds in ginkgo apodus are attached close together. No, the point of the last paragraph was kind of the evolution about the seeds, not this specific plan, this specific step on the evolution on its own. Ginkgo apodus is important because of its age and because it provides information about the structural evolution of ginkgo. Maybe. Zhao Zhen's conclusion about the persuasive trend in the evolution of ginkgo is the most well-documented find. So no, just never says that. So that's an assumption. It has long been known that ginkgo that existed 65 billion years ago were not much different. So no, he doesn't make that point. So it's probably going to be big, but let's make sure we can prove it. So the last paragraph says, the importance, so the topic sentence is the importance of this intermediate ginkgo is that it fits nicely in the age gap between the ancient ginkgo 170 million years ago and fossils that are essentially the same as the modern ginkgo about 65 million years ago. And the rest of the paragraph kind of describes how the seed-bearing structures changed over time. So how this kind of has, this intermediate has branched the gap. So B is correct then. The main point is that it provides information in the evolution between the most ancient and the modern ginkgo. Okay. In line 73 of passage B, the word conveniently is primarily used. So they give us the line and the word. So this is a word most nearly means. It's primarily used to emphasize that the structure of ginkgo apodes helped ginkgo researchers. It is also conveniently intermediate in structure. So it's intermediate in time, and then its structure is kind of halfway between the ancient and the new structure of ginkgos. So it helps fill an evolutionary gap because it's intermediate in its structure. So it explains how the ginkgo went from one form to another. But let's look at the other ones. Explain why they have been able to find, so it doesn't explain why they were able to find intact ginkgos. It doesn't explain, oh, it was preserved in this type of soil or something. Prove why modern ginkgo is a common plant. Nope. Doesn't tell us why it's a common plant. Precisely date, nope. Okay. Doesn't help us better date the ancient ginkgo. Passage B makes clear that which of the following is a characteristic of ginkgo geminuses that has nearly disappeared in ginkgo-like plants over millions of years. Okay, so this is very much kind of a word search. Go back and find if we don't remember it. 5 seed-bearing stalks associated with each leaf. More than one seed on each seed-bearing stalk. Seeds attached close to one another, branches on seed-bearing stalks. Let's go back. This is all very specific. So which of the following is a characteristic of the ancient plant that has nearly disappeared? So this ancient plant has a seed-bearing stalk that divided into 3 or 4 branches, each bearing a single seed at its tip. So we divide into 3 or 4 branches. Zhaozhen concluded that the persuasive trend in the evolution of ginkgo, at least in the seed-bearing structures, has been one of reduction from about 6 seeds on separate stalks to about 2 seeds on an unbranched seed stalk. So essentially, we went from one branch or many branches to one branch. So that's what's changed a lot. Nothing about each leaf. It's always kind of been so I'm just looking. Passage B makes clear that which of the following is a characteristic of the ancient ones that has nearly disappeared. So more than one seed on each seed-bearing structure. No, because it's 2 seeds. So that one's contradicted. And then nothing about seeds being attached close together. Okay, let's look at these last 3. Which of the following points from passage A does Crane explain in more detail in passage B? A botanist often becomes interested in ginkgo early in his or her training. No, that's only talked about in passage A. It is surprising that few fossils related to the evolution of ginkgo have been found in no, because he only mentions in B that it's surprising that we haven't found more in this area. The ginkgo is not very obviously related to any of the other living species of flowering plants. He makes that very clear in passage A, but not B. A difference between modern ginkgo and the fossil material from China that Zhaozhen has worked on is the way the seeds attached. Yes. In passage A, what he does is he says right here, and he's noticed relating to this guy, and what he's noticed is that there are some differences in the way the seeds are attached in these fossils, but in the grand scheme, things are not very different. Here he actually goes into detail about exactly what Zhaozhen has noticed about how they're attached. Okay. 39. It can most reasonably be inferred from information provided in passage B that when Crane refers to fossil material in passage A, he's most specifically referring to. Okay, so let's go back and look. 33. And what he's noticed is that there Here we go. And that work has been done now by my colleague Zhao Jian, who has worked on younger fossil material from China. And what he's noticed is that there's some differences in how the seeds attach to the fossil plants. So what's the fossil material he's working on? Well, if we look at kind of the fossils that this Zhao Chen is working on, what we get from passage B is they kind of contain everything. We get it from this paragraph. He goes through kind of everything they have, from the seeds to the branches to the structures. So fossil materials is not just the leaves or the seeds, but it's all of it. So C on 39. What information about Crane's role as a ginkgo researcher is made clear in passage A, but not in passage B? Crane is aware of the abundance of fossil deposits that have been uncovered in Yexin Formation. No, he's aware in both passages. He references the research of his Chinese colleague in both. Crane has reviewed a book on ginkgo that Zhao Jian has written, giving the book high praise. Never mentions a book that Zhao Jian has written. So that's just outside of the scope of the passage. Crane has worked on ginkgo fossils directly, contributing to key findings about ginkgo. Yes. Passage A, Crane references his work in the last paragraph on the more modern ginkgos from 65 million years ago. Passage B, he's only looking at his colleague's work, but let's just look at J. Crane has closely followed Zhao Jian's research on ginkgo. We can see that from both passages. Okay. Sorry if that video took a little longer than you had expected. Again, I know that when you're actually doing this test, you're going to be going through it much faster and processing much faster. But we kind of took our time on this one just so that you could see the extent to how to go through the different answer choices and how to make sure that you're finding support. The best advice I can give you, though, is that if any one question is taking more than a minute to find the answer to, leave it. Take your best guess and leave it, okay? It's not worth it to not be able to get to 5 questions because you spend several minutes on one question. So just kind of have an internal timer, have a good sense of what's where, know where to look. But if you read something and you're really confused and you read it and you're still confused, take an educated guess and come back to it if time permits. Okay, good luck with the reading. I hope this video is helpful. And come back for videos on any of the other topics on the test.